Yes.
Hello everyone, welcome to the second talk of the day by Pravega. I'm glad to introduce our speaker, Professor Sivrani Tirupati, who will be giving a talk on the Milky Way and insights from stellar archaeology. Sivrani Tirupati is a professor at the Indian Institute of Astrophysics. She did her graduate work at the IIA and went on to work all around the world, which include the Université de Montpellier, France, Observatory Astronomico di Trieste, Italy, the University of Florida, and the Michigan State University. Her research is on studying the metal poor stars of the galaxy, studying the relationship between planetary bodies and their host stars, and also coming up with ways to construct better calibrated spectrographs that will allow astronomers to make more precise measurements. I now hand it over to Professor Sivrani.
Thanks, Pratyush, for a generous introduction. You can hear me well?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, I really would like to thank the organizers for this invitation, and it's a pleasure for me to inter interact with these young students. And I look forward to questions and the interaction section. So I try to um, provide some overview. So please feel free to ask any questions. Don't think it's very basic. Asking is the best way to learn. So nobody is judgmental on you. So please ask any questions. Okay. So I would also I may not know answers to these questions. Maybe I would refer you to some papers or books, or I would send an email. So please feel free to ask any questions. It's not that I would know everything. Okay, thank you so much. I would start this talk. So the talk title, as it says, Milky Way. Milky Way is our galaxy where we live, where our solar system and our Earth is part of this galaxy. And what do we know about Milky Way from a technique called stellar archaeology? So we are all very familiar with this term archaeology, and I would just go over and give some introduction what it means and how do we derive constraints to understand the formation of Milky Way. So, okay. So this is the kind of a talk overview, and I would I would give an introduction to Milky Way and then introduce the stellar archaeology. Maybe I would switch the. Yeah, sorry, I would probably start with the slides. This is the early slide. So I would start with the introduction on the stellar archaeology, then go into the introduction of Milky Way, and then talk about how the formation history of Milky Way as seen by the stellar archaeology. And I would discuss a little bit about the globular clusters and the Milky Way and the neighborhood of other galaxies. So before going into the talk, I will give some definitions. Sorry about that. Astronomers have very weird lot of terminologies which will put people off. So I don't want to discourage students. So these are our very simple qualitative definitions. So I would just go over. So in my talk, I will be talking about a term called metallicity. So metallicity is referred to any elements beyond hydrogen and helium. All the elements of the periodic table beyond hydrogen and helium are considered as metallicity for astronomers. And these elements are synthesized in stars. So most often metallicity is also used as iron abundance. The reason why people use iron abundances or the chemical content of iron in a star or oxygen in the case of the intergalactic medium, the gas of the Milky Way or anywhere in the universe. The gas, the chemical composition of the gas is measured by using the oxygen abundances. And in stars, we use iron as a proxy for the metal content. So the reason is just convenience because iron has so many transitions. So we can it's easy to detect these atomic transitions of this multi-electron system. It's not iron is the most dominant, or it's not the most abundant element in the universe, but it produces a lot of atomic transitions, so it's easy to measure you can see the transitions of these elements. In the case of ISM, we use oxygen or carbon or nitrogen, but the reason is because you would have heard in the previous talk or somewhere. So the Milky Way consists of gas, dust, and hot, cold gas, molecular gas, all that. So in the what happens is these heavy elements like iron, silicon, they all form into dust grains, so which you can't very easily probe. So the gas is probed by elements, very volatile elements like which don't condense into grains. So oxygen is used as a proxy for metallicity. And this is again another definition. So we call so Fe by H in square bracket. That's called as the metallicity. So if you say zero metallicity means it's our sun, solar metallicity. So all metallicity is measured with respect to sun. So it's in the, so you can see logarithm of number of iron atoms versus number of hydrogen atom in a star minus logarithm of iron over hydrogen in sun. So zero means it's solar metallicity. It's same metal content like our sun. And if it is negative, it is metal poor, and it is positive, it's metal rich. So, so here some guiding numbers. So, so minus 1.5 is the halo of the Milky Way. I would go into what is the meaning of halo and disk of Milky Way in the next couple of slides. So halo of the old halo stars in the Milky Way have metallicity of minus 1.5, and there are also very metal poor stars which are below minus 2.5. Then the globular clusters, the clusters of stars which are very old, they are as old as the universe. So they are they have a metallicity of minus 2.5, the most metal poor ones. And here are some definitions of what is. So the old and metal poor stars are the first stars which are formed with the primordial Big Bang nucleus composition, like purely hydrogen and helium. So they are called POP3 stars. And then the next generation stars which are formed from the materials polluted by the first generation supernovae, they are called the second generation stars or POP2 stars. And the sun-like stars which have gone through several generation of pollution by supernovae are called the solar metallicity star, which are called POP1 stars. And so this is a spectra. You can, I don't know whether the lines, the spectral lines come in clearly. So the plots on the left-hand side is trying to show a magnesium line. So there are three magnesium, the broad lines are magnesium lines. So these are absorption lines. So what it means is you might have heard about Fraunhofer lines in the solar spectra. So these dark bands are these Fraunhofer bands. So in a star which, we can take the light from a sun and pass it through a spectrograph, and then we can see these, like pass it through a spectrograph which will have a prism or a grating or something like that which disperses the light, and you would see these dark bands. So these are magnesium lines which are very prominent here. And if a star is metal poor, you would see these lines are very weak. So this is how we detect metallicity or composition of any lines. So just to give you a picture, like so the scent, like for example, sun, this is the structure of sun. So you would see the core is very hot, like these are million degrees of Kelvin where the nuclear reactions happen. But this, so the radiation coming from these very interiors all the way from the photosphere until the convection zone. So they are essentially a black body. So you wouldn't see any Fraunhofer lines from that. So the lines, whatever we are seeing in the spectrum, are the outer layer, very outer layer of the star. So we are basically sampling the very outer layers of the star, not what is happening inside the core of a star. Unless there is some mixing which happens and brings the material to the outside, we don't see what exactly happens, the nuclear reactions, what is happening in the star. We only know there is nuclear reaction based on the energy transport. We don't know based on the chemical content. So in first time, the material from interiors come to the surface during when the star becomes a giant branch, where the star expands and the material gets mixed, and you would all the CN cycle process of hydrogen burning process nuclei, they all come to the surface. So okay, again, just to so this is the schematic diagram of Milky Way, our galaxy. So we have you can see on the right the central region. This is the like a front view, and this is the side view of the galaxy. So in the central regions are the core and the bulge, and this is the disk, and then these are the halo. And this halo, there is a stellar halo, and there is also a dark matter halo, which is extended much further. And so this disk stars are called the metal-rich stars, and our Milky Way is our sun is one of the disk stars, and halo stars are the metal-poor stars. So stellar archaeology, when I mean stellar archaeology, what we are trying to do is we are looking at the chemical abundances of these very chemical content of these very old and metal poor stars that would have been probably polluted by the previous generation of stars, which we can't see it right now because they are massive and they exploded and they are dead for long ago. So we want to study these low mass stars which are polluted by the first supernovae and try to infer the history. So this is like doing kind of a forensic science where you see what has happened, the current situation, you analyze the current composition of the stars and then try to predict what would have happened earlier. So this is the cosmic timeline. Not going into much detail, but just wanted to show some of these major milestones. So after the Big Bang, the universe expanded and then continuously tried to cool. And then around first 1 minute or so, you first form these neutrons and protons. And then around 3 minutes, that's when the Big Bang nucleosynthesis starts. You make the first hydrogen and helium, deuterium and lithium. These are the elements which are made during Big Bang. And then universe try to expand further because it's so hot. It expands, and we only have elements like hydrogen and helium, which are very poor radiators of energy. So they don't cool the gas very easily until we form hydrogen molecule. So there is a long time, it's called dark ages, where nothing happens in the universe. It keep on expanding until hydrogen molecule could form, where the clouds or the gas start to radiate out the heat from the gas, and then form some condensations, gravitational collapse, and then it makes the first stars. And these first stars make all these elements, what we going to see in the next slides. So this is the kind of enrichment history. After Big Bang, you have these first, what we call the POP3 stars, which are primarily made up of this Big Bang nucleosynthetic material. These we call it as a primordial material. And these stars expand, and like these are thought to be very massive. That is based on theory. We still don't know how massive are these first stars. that is something which is interesting, and that's an active study in this field. And these theoretically, it is expected these first stars to be very massive, and they expand. So they quickly evolve because massive stars have a shorter lifetime. Low mass stars have a longer lifetime. So the massive stars explode as supernovae in like 100 to 200 million years, and then they make all these elements. And these chemical elements are very good radiator of heat because these multi-electrons are needed to have several transitions. So any kinetic energy is the heat could be, it can lose by radiating into photons, and they cool the gas. So when you cool the gas, you can form small stars. So that's when the first low mass stars would have formed. So we are probably basically starting to look at stars which are formed at these epochs. So we just want to see how these elements evolved from Big Bang till now. So purely hydrogen and helium to the entire periodic table of elements. Something is okay. So this is the kind of a composition of sun, and you can see that hydrogen is the 73% is hydrogen and 25% is helium, and rest only 1% correspond to all the heavy elements in the baryonic universe. And these are the solar system abundances. So these are relative to silicon because these are from meteors. They also agree very well with our sun's abundances. For in the case of sun, we always calculate with respect to hydrogen. In the case of Earth or any meteor, you try to do it with respect to silicon. So these are the various peaks. These various peaks also indicate various nuclear processes which are happening in the interiors of the stars. Okay, I will quickly go over, and unless there are questions, I wouldn't spend a lot of time because we have to cover a lot of things. So Big Bang, as we said, it makes deuterium, helium, and lithium. And this is the relative hydrogen to helium abundances predicted by theory, and we can also observe these elements in the intergalactic medium. And lithium is also can also be observed in Milky Way gas as well as in stars. So observationally, we can test the Big Bang nucleosynthesis. And beyond lithium and helium, the nucleosynthesis didn't go further because the next element we know, beryllium and boron, so they don't have an unstable nuclei. So the so they decay back to helium again. So this is called the bottleneck in the Big Bang nucleosynthesis. By then, the universe expanded further, and you have to wait till the nuclear burning process, the 3 helium nuclei come together inside stars to make carbon. So this triple alpha or the 3 helium nuclei to make carbon is not possible in Big Bang because you need 3 atoms, right? So you need 3 nuclei, and the densities and temperatures were so low at that time. So the universe started expanding, and we couldn't make any carbon in the Big Bang. So these observed abundances put a lot of constraints on the Big Bang nucleosynthesis and also the universe expansion rate and the temperatures. So this is the kind of periodic table you would have after the first few minutes of the Big Bang. And so then about 200 million years later in the Big Bang, we form first stars. So basically the first stars, you must have heard in the previous lectures, so the cosmic microwave background or the universe is kind of has, it's not uniform, we can take it as homogeneous and isotropic, but there are some minor fluctuations in the densities, and these fluctuations in densities start to form clumps. And these are called the protogalactic clumps, or these are also called mini halos. And so they are composed of both what is shown in red is the dark matter, and it's also the blue is the ordinary matter. Of course, I have not taken it. This picture doesn't really depict the fraction. Like ordinary matter should be much lower than the dark matter. So basically, the dark matter drives the collapse, and because the dark matter does not interact with the photons or radiation, so the ordinary or the baryonic matter, once it forms the H2 molecule, it starts to radiate, and then it starts to cool faster than the dark matter. As it cools, the baryonic matters get concentrated more in the center of the galaxy, or the centers of these protogalactic clumps, and then you would form the first objects in the universe. So the dark matter halo just surrounds these mini halo, and only the baryonic matters which forms in the center makes all these first objects. And this is a theoretical diagram again. It's showing like what is the initial masses of the stars, first stars, and how it would end up. So I just wanted to just emphasize on this. Any objects which are probably greater than 300 solar masses, they don't explode as a supernovae. They will directly collapse into a black hole. And objects which are lower than 200 solar masses, they would explode as supernovae. And only those masses we can trace, because they explode and make nucleosynthetic materials like iron, various entire periodic table of elements. So we can only trace the elements made by objects, massive stars, which are the massive supernovae below 300 solar masses or so. Okay, so what do we know about these first stars from observations? So theoretically, they are expected to be very massive, but observationally, if they are massive, then they are evolved and we can't see them. Maybe we have to see them at very, very high redshifts, because that's when you would see them as young and forming. And even with the future telescopes like JWST and TMT, that is 30-meter telescopes, and the James Webb Space Telescope. So even with that, it's very difficult to observe. So we still don't have any clue about the first stars from observations. So if the first stars are very low mass, then we should see them in the Milky Way. So there are a lot of searches in the Milky Way galaxy. Look for these metallic lines which I showed in the previous slides. So we look for stars which don't have any metals, or so currently we don't know any star that has zero metallicity. It doesn't have any iron lines. So the current record holder is about -7. So we don't see iron, but we see calcium in a star. That's one star which we know. So these are very interesting objects, and they provide clue about this early universe. And there are others surveys like, for example, the square kilometer array from using neutral hydrogen. I don't know whether you had some introduction on that. So as what would these first massive stars, they make these chemical elements. They also emit high energy radiation. They make UV and X-ray and gamma rays, and these UV and X-rays, they would ionize the gas or the intergalactic medium. So the hydrogen in the intergalactic medium would be ionized, and that signature can be seen in the radio wavelengths. So that also gives some clues about the redshift or epoch when these first stars could have formed. So there are some recent results which are very interesting, which shows, I won't go into it, but it's very similar to what we understand from metal poor stars. And there are also high redshift supernovae which we can observe, and their properties should also agree with whatever chemical composition which we see from metal poor stars. So these are all complementary studies for stellar archaeology. So we can have a cross check. And this is one interesting supernovae. It's called the pair instability supernovae. Objects which are like 150 to 250 solar masses, these are the massive supernovae that can happen in the universe. And these are primarily the photons are converted into electrons and positrons, and when they reach very high temperatures where these photons are converted into electrons and positrons, and this is an endothermic reaction, so the entire star is expected to explode. So they have a very clear abundance pattern if you see in the right. So what we call this is, call it as an odd even effect. So you can see all the even elements are highly enriched and all the odd elements are under abundance. So this kind of pattern is seen in the chemical composition that is made from these kind of pair instability supernovae. And that should be seen in stars which are formed from the ejecta of these kind of supernovae. And observationally, we don't see such signatures. And there are many other constraints which kind of tell us that pair instability supernovae were not very predominant in the early universe. And so this is so these are the various alpha capture elements which are made in the massive stars. And beyond iron, we don't make through hydrostatic burning. You know this binding energy diagram where beyond iron, the binding energy decreases. So we can't make these nucleus through fusion reactions. So how are the elements beyond iron is made? So this is, again, I would skip these slides if anybody wants. So this is the kind of structure of a supernovae where the core is, it's kind of an onion shell. So you can see how the nuclear reactions have proceeded from hydrogen to helium, helium to carbon, neon, oxygen. So these are all products of helium atom capture, that is helium nuclear capture, that's alpha capture, we call it as. Okay. So these are various elements which are produced, and you can also see the time scale. So hydrogen burning happens in 20 solar masses stars, about 10⁻⁷ years, but whereas silicon burning just over 1 week. So it's very short. So that also says why the chemical element abundances are different. So hydrogen and helium are the dominant. As other elements, heavier the elements, you see them very little amount in the universe. So after 200 million years, this is the kind of periodic table what you would see. And these are some of the supernovae ejecta. You can just some pictures of them. And so beyond iron, what the elements are made through what is called the slow and rapid neutron capture. So this is your familiar beta decay process. So what happens is when the neutron densities in the interiors of star is very high, it keeps capturing, because beyond iron it can't make anything. So the iron captures several neutrons until it reaches the photo disintegration versus the neutron capture cross section, the energy for what is needed for capturing neutron versus the photo disintegration. If the temperatures are too hot, it will disintegrate again into smaller nuclei. So what will happen in this case, like you would capture neutrons and do a beta decay. Beta decay is essentially an electron. So what will happen is, so neutron will become a proton plus a beta particle and climb up to the next element. So this is way. So you start from cadmium and you go to indium by beta decay. So in the slow neutron capture process, we take one step at a time. You capture one neutron and then beta decay to the next element. Capture one neutron and go to the next element. So capture one neutron. So it is one step at a time you take. So that is called slow neutron capture, where the beta decay time scales are faster than neutron capture timescale. But if the neutron densities are very high, you capture several neutrons and then beta decay. So this is called the rapid neutron capture. So these are the two neutron capture process, slow and rapid neutron capture. And so we don't know, we know where slow neutron capture process happens, but we don't know what are the possible places or in stars where these kind of high neutron densities occur. So, okay, this is again explanation like how various stable elements. So the site for our process or the rapid neutron capture process is still unknown. And the possible sites, we think it is supernovae or neutron star mergers. So I will just show, I don't know whether it will play. Sorry for the, I will, yeah. So these are two neutron stars. So they come, binary neutron stars, they come together. And so these neutron stars contains fully neutron rich material. And so they are in dense. So these are like, these are highly packed because of the degenerate pressure. That's like what you know about the Pauli's exclusion principle, which applies for the case of nuclei. So you would see these, they have a degenerate neutron, compact neutron rich material. And when two binary stars come together due to gravitational pull, they kind of decompress, they kind of expand, they pull each other, and the degeneration pressure kind of gets less, and then the neutron is converted into proton. So, and this proton again captures several neutrons, and you would see in the next slide, maybe I will show how the nuclear reactions comes about. And these are interesting objects because we must have learned these are one of the sources for gravitational waves radiation coming from black holes and neutron stars. So they also play a significant role in the case of making neutron-rich materials in the universe. No. Sorry. It didn't play well. Okay. Okay, I will just show here, like in this diagram. So these are what we know. You might have the x-axis is not very clearly visible. It's the neutron number, and y-axis is the proton number, and the black line is the stability valley of stability, where you have the neutron-rich materials or the nuclei which are present, stable nuclei that are present in the universe. So in the case of these neutron star mergers, they make all these nuclei along the neutron-rich region. It's called the drip line, neutron drip line. And then they beta decay further and then reach the value of stability. So that's how it's made in neutron star mergers. But then, so this is what we see in the metal poor stars. So we know to the time scale. Theoretically, we know what would be the time scale of a supernova explodes and becomes a neutron star merger, neutron star remnant. And if it's in a binary system, these two neutron stars could come together and then make this R process rich material. So what you see in the red points in this plot, these are various stars which are seen in the Milky Way, the halos. And if we, on the left, what if you can see, these are the black points are what is expected from neutron star mergers. So neutron star mergers take a long time to evolve and make. So they even whatever, let's say the first stars were massive stars which became neutron star, and then they merged to form the SAR process. Only at metallicities of -2 they can explode. The universe needs to, by then several supernovae would have exploded, and then the ISM or the stars would have enriched. So neutron stars take much longer to contribute to the intergalactic medium. So, but we see a lot of stars in the Milky Way galaxy, which has already neutron capture elements, this R process material like uranium, thorium, europium, and various elements which are rich in them. So you need to have some site or some star that can make these materials much early on in the universe. So we still don't know, it's still an open problem, though neutron star merges kind of make a good case, but we don't really understand. But supernovae is still a very difficult object. Theoretically, it's very difficult to explode a supernovae. So far, theoreticians could not make a supernovae explode in their computers based on the first principles of equations, first principles. So they have to, it's mostly driven by observation. So we still don't understand how these very rich or heaviest elements in the universe is made. Yeah, so then this is about, let's say, 1 giga years or so. After that, so stars like very low mass stars like our sun would also contribute to the chemical enrichment of the universe. So star like our sun, they would evolve from main sequence and then they become red giants. So main sequence, they have core hydrogen burning, and then when they come to red giants, they have shell hydrogen burning. So that is when first time this hydrogen burning products, because it's burning in the shell and the outer layers are convective, the photosphere is mixed by these hydrogen burning products. And then they become helium, they burn in the core, and then again they burn helium in the shell. This is called asymptotic giant branch because they are coming second time the becoming a giant. So in this phase, you have both hydrogen burning as well as helium burning is happening in the shell. And during this phase, there is a rich nuclear synthesis process which happens in these stars. So our sun would become an asymptotic giant brown star at some point of time. They make most of the carbon, and the slow neutron capture process is made in low mass stars like our sun, which becomes asymptotic giant branch. And this would happen about 1 giga years after Big Bang. So by 1 giga years or so, we almost populate the entire periodic table of elements. And if these kind of, so you would know this asymptotic giant branch stars, after they become planetary nebulae and the central star becomes a white dwarf. White dwarf is very similar to neutron star, but here you have electron degeneracy pressure. The electrons are, the pressure balance, that balances the gravity is due to the Pauli's exclusion principle that no two electrons can be in the same state. So the pressure is so much, the electrons are forced into same energies. So it doesn't allow and creates a pressure. It's called the degeneracy pressure. And these objects are called the white dwarfs. And if there are white dwarfs in binary system, in this case, and one of them, let's say this is a white dwarf and this is a low mass star which becomes a giant and accretes material. And so then what will happen is it exceeds the Chandrasekhar limit. That is the limit for the degenerate white dwarf. And if the masses exceeds this Chandrasekhar mass, then the whole star explodes. And these are called the type 1a supernovae. So these are not massive stars, these are low mass stars, but that in a binary system. So they make almost 2/3 of iron in the universe, but they don't make any of the alpha elements. So this is something interesting. So the takeaway here is, so different elements in the universe are made at different time scales because they are coming from different masses of the stars. So carbon, nitrogen, and sodium, they come about 1 million years time scale during stellar winds, and supernovae, they produce about 10 power 7 years. And for example, type 1a supernovae take much longer, like 10 power 9 years, and AGB stars, they take 10 power 10 years, 8 years to make these materials. So different time scales, and they produce various elements in different quantities. So this plot shows how the different elements, like this as atomic number and what is the amount it is produced. And you can see different masses of stars, they produce elements in different ratios. Like for example, you can see that type 1a supernovae, this is shown in red. It doesn't make any of the alpha elements, but makes the iron peak elements. Whereas the massive, the supernovae, they make more, say for example, this triangle which shows the 35 solar masses massive star, they make most of these lighter alpha elements because they quickly evolve and explode. So they don't have enough time for the hydrostatic burning of silicon and other elements. So the lower the supernovae, they make more of these alpha-rich materials. And lighter elements are made by more massive stars. So this is basic foundation of stellar archaeology. Different elements at different are ejected into the interstellar medium at different time scales and different ratios. So this is what we use it as diagnostic tool to understand the masses of star formation history of the galaxy. So I would just skip some of this. I think I'm running late. So let me check the time. Yeah. So this is the kind of metallicity in perspective in the universe. Like, so what you see is so these are different external globular clusters, or what is this? Large Magellanic Clouds and various other galaxies, and these are intergalactic medium, which are called the LAMP, Lyman alpha clouds, and external globular clusters. And what you notice is the Milky Way halo stars are the most metal poor system currently we can study. So they would give the most amount of clues about the early history of the galaxy. So where do we search for these very old first stars? This is simulations. So the first stars are found in the very central regions of the galaxies, where that's where the first stars would have formed. But then they quickly enrich and become metal rich. So you won't see metal poor stars here because the densities are so high, the star formation efficiency is very high that it quickly enriches the interstellar medium, and you wouldn't see metal poor stars. It's like a checking needle in a haystack. So you would see metal poor stars still in the centers of the galaxy, but in low number compared to the metal rich one. So it's very difficult, not very good way to search, but it's still interesting to look at them. But in the outer halos, you can find them, because I think I would probably go into the couple of slides and you would see why we are interested in the halo. Okay, I will again. Okay, so this is the, so in Milky Way, this is the various subsystems of Milky Way. Like, so in this, the central regions, as we saw in the previous slides, they are very dense and metal rich, and it's called the bulge. I'm not going into Milky Way also hosts a massive, supermassive black hole, and I'm not going into the details of that because it is interesting by itself. And yeah, so in the central regions you have old population, but they are also metal rich because the star formation efficiency is very high and quickly enriches the interstellar medium. And then there is a disk, and you can also see a slightly puffy disk. So the centrally located disk is called the thin disk, and the puffy disk is called the thick disk. And their origin seems to be very different. And we will see in the slides that why we think the structurally slightly different disk, why physically they have different origin of formation. And then surrounding that, you're also seeing some globular clusters, so globular clusters are seen both in the Milky Way halo as well as the bulge. So the bulge clusters are very old, but they are metal rich. But the halo clusters are metal poor, and they are also as old as the bulge clusters. And there is a surrounding dark matter halo in which the entire galaxy is embedded. And there is also hot corona, which is heated by the stars and various supernovae. And this is the picture of our nearby neighbor, Andromeda Galaxy, which is seen at different wavelengths. So the different wavelengths kind of probes different component of the galaxy, different phases of the interstellar medium. Like, for example, in the radio wavelengths, you would look at the neutral hydrogen of the galaxy. And infrared, you would see the dust composition. And in visible, you are seeing the stars. And in the case of ultraviolet, we will be seeing the very hot stars. So they are very massive stars, so they are very young. Because the old massive stars would have evolved off, whatever we are seeing now, any massive stars would have formed very recently. And the X-ray is mostly in the centers of the galaxy. So we can also, apart from this, we can also study the stellar orbits of these stars. So you can see the disk stars have rotation around the galactic center, and the halo stars, they go in an elliptical orbit or an eccentric orbit. They're not necessarily following the disk-like structure. And the bulge stars, again, they also move in a very random fashion. And so that also shows the origin when they are formed in the formation history of the Milky Way. So this is just a historic note how Herschel and Shapley got the origin of Milky Way. So the Herschel thought the sun is in the center of the galaxy, and then Shapley found sun is not at the center, but at the one side of the disk, and based on the globular cluster distributions. And just 1 second, excuse me. I thought since you people are going to talk about, discuss this during your hands-on session, I will also show this. So if we consider only the visible matter in the galaxy, we expect, so if you, we can, so these orbits are measured based on the spectra, like you take, you know about the Doppler shifts. So if there is a star, which is in the disk, and if it is coming towards you or away from you, you would be able to measure their shift in the spectral lines. They would be blue shifted if they are coming towards you, and red shifted if they are going away from you. So that is the radial, what we call it as radial velocity. We can also study what is called proper motion, that is perpendicular to your line of sight. So if you observe a star, I think at let's say 100 years back, and now you would see the positions have moved, and based on these you can again study the how the stellar orbits change. Yeah, so based on this, if you look at so this radial velocities, so they should obey a Keplerian distribution law. So then you would see if it's only contains visible matter, you would see a drop like R square drop in the. But what we observe is a flattening of this radial velocities, indicating there is matter which is in the outside of the disk. So that is, we think it's due to the dark matter halo. You might be working on this in the. So this is also, there are also supernovae bubbles, like in the central region. We said that there is efficient star formation and they explode as supernovae, and these supernovae also contribute to heating of the interstellar gas, and these are the X-ray and gamma ray emissions, which shows the feedback, how much it heats and also affects the further star formation. And there are also these high velocity clouds. So we don't know the origin of them yet. So these are neutral hydrogen clouds which are surrounding Milky Way, and these are either part of some other galaxy, the gas from other galaxy which got accreted by Milky Way, or it's something which has gone from the disk to the halo. But based on the metallicity information, metal content, we find that these are, most of them are metal poor. So it is likely that they are extragalactic in origin. And okay, so this is just to show how Milky Way would have formed, starting from the, sorry for the spelling mistake, I think there are many of them. So starting from the very the primordial density fluctuations, which we saw following the Big Bang. So when we know that in the beginning, the photons and the baryons were together, and then once we have hydrogen atom which is formed, then the photons kind of free stream. Before that, the electrons scatter the photon by Thomson scattering, and then the universe is optically thick. And once the hydrogen atom forms, the electron is captured by the proton and the hydrogen atom is formed, then the photons freely escape. And this free streaming of the photons is what we see as the cosmic microwave background. And they are not uniform. There is a slight fluctuations in the density, which is seen as the fluctuation in temperature. And so these are the structures which this density fluctuation starts to make a big galaxy, and the first stars and the big galaxy. So this is there are two theories which explains the formation of Milky Way, and the earlier one is by Egan, Lindenbell, and Shapley, I think, I forgot. Yeah, Sandage. Yeah, ELS. Yeah, Egan, Lindenbell, and Sandage. This model, the proto-galaxy, which started forming from the primordial cloud and collapsed to form the stars, and then once it forms stars, then they don't have the drag force. They don't. So when gas gets dissipated and then form into disk, dissipates its angular momentum to form disk. But if the stars are collisionless particles and they still move in the same initial orbits of the proto-galactic cloud. So as the proto-galaxy collapses and stars form, and these initial stars are the halo stars, and once the gas settles down into a disk and then further star formation happens, those stars are the disk stars. And so this is the kind of a rapid collapse model. As far as the model goes, the Milky Way disk could have been formed by 300 million years or so. It's very rapid. But what we see is we find the Milky Way disk stars are much older, and also we see that they are more metal rich. So if it is formed by 300 million years, the enrichment history we saw different masses of stars will take a long time to enrich the interstellar medium. So if the galaxies, the disk forms in 300 million years, then we would see stars which are very metal poor in the disk. But what we see is stars which are in the Milky Way disk are more metal rich. So that means they are formed from already pre-enriched materials. So by the time the disk is formed, several generations of supernovae have contributed to the gas, and that enriched gas forms the disk, and then further star formation has happened. So this also gives important clues at what epoch disk and various structures in the Milky Way would have formed. And since this yearless model doesn't explain the enrichment history, so another model is proposed by Jin and Searle. This is very similar to hierarchical formation, which is the cosmological hierarchical merging of various structures. So hierarchical galaxy formation means small structures try to form big structures. So the galaxy itself didn't form as a one monolithic collapse, but it formed small clumps, and then they came together to form a galaxy which has disk. So in this scenario, so this is kind of more supported because we would see a lot of these globular clusters, and also we see some remnants which is still remaining, which is not for. So these could be satellite galaxies of Milky Way. So such satellite galaxies are also seen in, and it's predicted by the cosmological simulations as well. So this is more appealing model, and so there are other clues which also gives some important clues to when things would have formed, in structures could have formed, different structures of Milky Way, especially the disk, thin and thick disk would have formed, and the halo would have formed, is from the alpha element abundances. So here, this plot, I just spent some time with this plot because this is we would be talking about it a little more in then another few slides. So we know in the so this part, this flat curve, so it indicates the as the metallicity increases, the alpha abundances and metallicity remains the same. So it doesn't change. The ratio between the alpha to ion doesn't change. So that means the source or the star that produced, or the supernovae that produced alpha, is also producing ion. So that's why it remains in the flat curve. So this is the typical signature of the type 2 supernovae, that is supernovae that is formed from massive stars. And then we also heard about type 1a supernovae, which is a binary merger of two, like a white dwarf in a binary system. So where the white dwarf accretes material from the companion and becomes super Chandrasekhar mass and explodes as supernovae. So they make only iron, but not make alpha elements. So iron increases, but alpha starts to decrease because these type 1a supernovae don't make alpha elements. So this epoch, when this is called Ni in the galactic chemical evolution diagram. So the metallicity at which the Ni happens is when the type 1a supernovae contribute to the galaxy. So this is kind of quite important. Like if a galaxy that has very efficient star formation, then this value will shift this way. And if the star formation is rate is very high, that means it's a massive galaxy efficiently forming star, this Ni will extend, the flat portion will extend much further. And if it is a galaxy which is not forming stars very efficiently, then it would have a Ni much at a lower metallicities. So this is a kind of a very good diagram which is used in many galactic chemical evolutionary models. I would just show like how it is similar things can also be studied in various other elements and infer the history of chemical evolution. So in the case of Milky Way, what is found is, so there is a big gap which was found between the thick and thin disk stars. So for a long time, the alpha element abundance remained the same, but iron has got increased. So, and if you look at the ages of the system, so there seems to be some gap. And the proposal by early on was maybe something when and this exactly matches with the type 1a contribution, but this gap kind of indicates for some reason the star formation was stalled in the Milky Way galaxy. So this could be either due to a major merging event, and that time we didn't have much clue, but it was known that there is some gap. And so now with this Gaia satellite, I think you might have heard about this is astrometric satellites. It gives the positions and the motions in 6-dimensional space for every stars in our Milky Way galaxy. And so they combined the positions and also the spectroscopy, and then they found there are, if you look at again the same plot I'm showing, this alpha abundances and the the metallicity, and you can see there are two populations, there are two branches, and also in the color magnitude diagram on the left, you are able to see there are two branches. So it looks like there are two populations of stars, and there is an alpha poor population and a slightly alpha rich population, which is seen in the Milky Way thick disk. So so they found also kinematically these stars are coming just into the Milky Way disk, and they, based on this data, they identified there is a quite massive galaxy, not as massive as Milky Way, but it is I think it's about 10 times lesser than Milky Way, or but it's significantly massive, but not as massive as Milky Way. A galaxy called they gave a name Enceladus, merged into Milky Way about 10 giga-years or so. So that is based on their numerical simulations. And I think I would show some videos of how the merging happens. And so these field stars, so all these discussions so far we have been doing with the field stars. The problem with the field stars or the halo stars or the disk stars is they are formed, they're located at, if you point anywhere in the sky, the stars are different magnitudes and colors. They may be located at different distances and they might have formed at different ages. So this is a typical color magnitude diagram. So it doesn't say anything at all, like for example. So, but in the case of clusters, which we know that they formed at the same time and they are located at the same distance. And if you plot their color magnitude diagram, you would see that they follow an evolutionary track. So the low mass stars still are on the main sequence. The massive stars have evolved off and they have become red giants. And here these are the stars which are burning the core helium. So these are stars which are more massive than the main sequence stars. So clusters are very important, provides a much more important diagnosis, because we currently have to rely on this gap, and when this kind of merging happens based on theoretical studies, we don't have an independent way of estimating an age of a star. We know basically from the chemical evolution, chemical composition, from the star formation, how much from the first supernovae, when the first star formation has started, how much time it has taken. But if for some reason the star formation has delayed, so the delta T, when the star formation actually started, we don't know. So for example, different parts of the Milky Way galaxy, for example, like you would have something which is started forming stars very early on would be metal rich, but something which started much later would be metal poor. But the metal poor star doesn't mean that it is old, just that it started from the cloud, or the protogalaxy started forming stars much later than the other protogalaxy. So ages is very important, and it's difficult to find ages for field stars. So hence clusters play an important role, and globular clusters in that sense very useful. They are very old stars. They are very old clusters, and they're also integral part of many galaxies, because you would see all the galaxies host globular clusters. So this is it's a artist, yeah, it's a not actually Milky Way's actual galaxy, but the positions of the globular clusters are accurate based on the measurements. So it's kind of gives a realistic illustration. So we have about 200 globular clusters around Milky Way, and whereas a similar galaxy like Sombrero Galaxy, it has about 2,000 globular clusters. So some galaxies are, for some reasons, they are rich in globular clusters, some are poor in globular clusters. So that also should, since we see clusters in most of the galaxies, and there is a scaling relation, like the masses of the galaxy is higher, the number of clusters is high. The masses of the most massive cluster is also high. So this also correlates with the center black hole in the galaxy. So since it's an integral part, the clusters are integral part of galaxy, they should provide some important clues. Sorry, excuse me. Yeah, so we don't really know when globular clusters formed in our galaxies. It's still an open problem. And we think globular clusters need very high densities to form clusters of stars. And they are metal poor. And so there are no metal poor globular clusters less than minus 2.5. There seems to be a ceiling in metallicity. So that also gives some clues. So current understanding is these kind of clusters could have formed at redshifts of 10. That is like almost like soon after, like less than 1 billion years after Big Bang, and when the universe is ionized by the first stars. And since it is ionized, so you need massive galaxies only can form stars. So because its universe is hot, and you need hotter gas means you need more mass to balance the gravity. So so that's why you would more massive galaxies would have hosted these globular clusters, or these clusters would have formed during the star formation peak. So we still don't know these when, what epoch these clusters are formed. And clusters also have bimodal distribution, at least in Milky Way, and also seen in Andromeda Galaxy. So there are clusters in the bulge, which are metal rich, and there are clusters in halo, which are metal poor. So these would have different origin. So the bulge clusters would have come from probably the monolithic collapse of the protogalaxy. And these halo clusters would have come through accretion of satellite galaxies onto Milky Way. And this we see very often in the Milky Way. For example, this is one of the satellite galaxies, which is like, this is the current picture. You can see stars almost going around the galaxies. This is called the Sagittarius dwarf galaxy. And so it's several billion years ago that it merged, and it has gone around the galaxies at least 2 times. And you see, you can chemically tag them. They are very different from the Milky Way halo. and their velocities also give us an indication of this merger history. So this is what galactic archaeology is about, looking at various chemical elements which are made at different times in different ratios, and also looking at the kinematical information. We can say each star, where it has come, or the group of stars, what is the origin. They formed within the galaxy or within a cluster or within external galaxy which merged long back. So this is the local group where we live in. So there are about 100 galaxies or so, and these are the big galaxies, the Andromeda and the Pinwheel galaxies. But all the others are dwarf galaxies. So smaller dwarf galaxies are the maximum in number. So it's the same way how the IMF goes. If you look at the masses of the stars, the low mass stars are the maximum in number. Massive stars are fewer. Same way galaxies, smaller galaxies are the larger in number in the universe compared to the large galaxies. Large galaxies are fewer. I think I will just leave with some this thing. This is a simulation. I think it's of how these enchiladas would have kind of merged onto Milky Way. So I think this can go on. I have one more video to play, but that can go on without we could um, start any questions. I think so. This is the red points show this objects which are merged, and you can see that they are going through the disk. I'm sorry. Yeah, so this is the other one, just showing Milky Way in the supercluster. And I will leave this with that. Yeah, this is a nature video. I thought just to show how we are part of a bigger system, like the Milky Way is part of a bigger clusters of galaxies. So I will leave it and let this go on. And I thank everybody for your attention. I'm sorry if I have gone with a lot of technical terms, but feel free to ask me any questions.
All right, before we start asking questions, I want to inform all workshop participants that they need to fill up the Google
Hello?
Forms that has been linked in the Q&A box. And all right, so first question, how does dark matter drive the condensation of matter
Pratyush, you
when
can hear.
they How does dark matter drive the condensation of matter when they don't interact at all?
Hello?
Hello, ma'am, can you hear me? Hello?
Hello, yeah, we can hear you. Can you hear us, ma'am?
Yeah, any questions from the audience?
Yes, ma'am. Can you hear us, ma'am?
Can you hear us?
So this just shows that we are part of a bigger supercluster. Initially, we thought we are part of a Virgo cluster, which is about, I think, 10 million, 10 megaparsecs away. But now we think we are also part of a larger superclusters called Laniakea. It's a Hawaiian name given to this supercluster. Yeah.
Hello, ma'am. Can you hear me?
So these are all based on, again, kinematics of galaxies. Each point represents one galaxy, and these are observations. So these are not simulations. These are observed with large spectroscopic surveys. Again, we use the Doppler shifts to measure their redshifts and um, study how they like there are larger structure moving towards to some particular point or not. So that's how these are made.
Hello, ma'am.
So this is what we call as a great attractor. We don't know, there is nothing inside in that region, but all galaxies seems to move towards that particular point called the great attractor. And we think it could be a dense material where we can't, it's no visible matter is there. So you can see Milky Way here. It's quite far from that. And so these are the movement is all based on observed. So initially we thought it's we are part of the Virgo cluster, but we now based on data, we think we are part of a much bigger system, galaxies. So it feels kind of humbling to see that we are part of a tiny, very small part of this big universe system of complex galaxies. And even then, we can also say that every hydrogen atom in our body is come from Big Bang. So it's kind of interesting to think we are part of a small system, but we still represent the material from the Big Bang, where things all originate. Yeah. Yeah, I can see some questions.
Yes. Hello, ma'am. Could you hear us? Can you hear us? Are we audible?
Okay, I will go from the bottom. Like Vartika has asked, just like the high velocity clouds, how do we determine if something is intergalactic or extragalactic? Are there any distinct boundaries? Yeah, that's a very good question. So normally we look at if it is galactic origin, we think it shouldn't exceed the escape velocity of our galaxy, which is I think about 200 kilometers per second or so. And so these are called high velocities because they are much faster than those. And again, it's not a sharp boundary just based on velocities. There could be some energetic event which could, there are stars which are escaping at very high velocities which are originating from the centers of the galaxies. Mainly probably they are kicked out of the galactic center due to the interaction with the massive black hole in the center. So we see very high velocity stars coming out of the centers, and in the halo you can see them. So velocity is not the only thing. Yeah, we need to look at other aspects and see them not as one event. If there are group of such objects, then we should be able to find their origin, but it's very difficult. We need more than one evidence to to identify whether they are intergalactic origin, extragalactic origin, or they are from Milky Way. Yeah. So the next question: if there was nothing before Big Bang, not even space, where did the universe start expanding? And for that matter, how did the singularity happen itself? Yeah, this is a very philosophical question. We don't know whether there are many theories. Like I'm not an expert in this, but there are there are many theories which say that we are part of multiverse, and there are several big bangs simultaneously happening. Just we can't, our observability allows us doesn't allow us to see the other part of the Big Bang. So there are many such theories, but I'm not competent enough to answer that. Yeah. Oh, okay. I couldn't hear, that's what. Okay, I understood. Okay. So I don't know why I couldn't. We could do a mic check.
Hi,
Ma'am,
ma'am.
can you
Is
hear
this
Yeah,
us?
now, yeah, now I can hear, yes.
Okay, you can hear us? All right, good. Okay, we'll take the next questions then. There was actually a connection disturbance in between, so you couldn't hear any of the questions. So, all right. The next question is, on what basis do we infer that metal-poor stars would be at the Milky Way GCs?
Okay, metal poor stars are okay. We know stars could form in clusters, but so metal poor stars are in the globular clusters as well as in the halo field, and we know the globular cluster stars are metal poor because we can study them spectroscopically. We take a spectra of them and we measure the ion content on various elements, and then we infer based on the chemical contents. Like for example, I was showing the alpha by ion ratio is an indicator of whether some star has formed before the type 1a supernovae has contributed to the galaxy. So that kind of markers, there are several such chemical ratio markers are there in archaeology. So based on that, we also know it's not just metal poor, they're also old. Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah.
All right, next question. Is there any relation between the size of the universe and the temperature provided that we also have to account for the dark matter present?
So the question says the size of the universe and
the temperature.
Temperature. Yeah, so universe is expanding. As it expands, it cools. So currently, yeah, I don't know whether I can answer. Like what we can see is we have an observable horizon. We can't see beyond the redshift where galaxies expand at velocities of greater than velocity of light. We can't see. So that is an observable horizon. So we can't observe anything. So we really don't know, I think, the actual size of the galaxies. But the temperatures, for example, cosmic microwave background provides the current background, so which is uniform across the sky, that is in all directions. They are homogeneous, and we see that microwave background temperature is about 2.7 Kelvin or so. And this is uniform, and it should have come from the relic radiation from Big Bang. So that also gives us clue about how the temperature evolution has happened. Does it answer? Yeah.
Next question. How was it decided that good site for our process could be supernovae or neutron star merging?
Yeah, it's a very tricky question. It's we still don't know. There are this is actively currently it's a hot topic in stellar archaeology. So based on there is something called universality of our process. So what we see in the very old metal poor stars, there are some stars which are highly enhanced in our process. So they would have probably formed from the ejecta without it got mixed into the galaxy ISM. So they have something like 1,000 times solar europium, thorium, such elements. So they are direct. It gives a direct clue of how much material is produced. So if you look at the pattern of these R process elements, they are exactly same as the pattern, the ratios basically are exactly same in Milky Way, in the sun, as well as these old stars. So that means several generations of supernovae would have contributed to our supernovae, or whatever site which made our process would have contributed to solar abundances. Sun has received contribution from so many supernovae or neutron star mergers. So these different generations of our process production is same as one event. So that means for several giga years, our process site knows exactly to produce different ratios at the right amount. So it should, because we have astrophysical sites are very different. So it should be physically driven. It's driven by physics rather than astrophysical sites to produce a robust or universal or constant ratios of these R process. So we think neutron star mergers could be an ideal site because they are more robust in making all the way till uranium and thorium, where you need very high neutron densities. But we also think the lighter all process element could have been made from supernovae. So this is the current status. We think there could be many sites to make our process in lighter R process like supernovae, and heavier R process like uranium, thorium, europium, and so on would have made from the actinides, or made from neutron star mergers. But it's still an open problem. We still don't know. There are still several things we don't. If we kind of tweak the merging timescales of neutron star mergers, then we can't match the difference between type 1a timescale and neutron star merger timescale. So you have to tweak a lot of parameters. So we still don't understand that well.
All right, next question. How does dark matter drive the condensation of matter when they don't interact at all?
Yeah, okay, that's again a nice question. Like, so initial collapse is initiated by when there is kind of an adiabatic collapse where the matter is not able to cool through any radiation. So initial gravitational collapse is driven mainly by the dark matter, but once the baryonic matter, which could emit and cool faster, then it would kind of collapse faster than the dark matter. But dark matter has gravity, right? It doesn't interact with radiation, but it provides gravitational force, so it will help in driving the initial collapse.
All right. Are the synthetic elements created on Earth found to occur naturally in supernovae or other stars? Also, if we can detect other unknown elements, have any unknown elements have been detected so far in these supernovae or stars?
Yeah, so there are several elements which were detected for the first time in stars than on the Earth. Like, for example, like even helium was first discovered on Sun during on the Earth during the solar eclipse. But there are elements which are short-lived isotopes like technetium, which are made by like slow neutron capture. So that has been observed in asymptotic giant branch stars, which just but supernovae happen very fast. So we don't right now. There are some good evidences. For example, this one of the candidate for gravitational wave mergers of. So we also have evidences of our process production by neutron star mergers, because we know through gravitational wave detection that these objects are neutron stars and binary system. And then from the light curve, when they become the supernovae, these are called kilonovae because they are not as energetic as when it makes this explosion. So these they found that there is a like absorption due to these heavy elements, because they produce more heavier elements than normal supernovae, because our process elements are heavier and they absorb the radiation much more efficiently because of many more transitions. So based on this light curve or the evolution of the luminosities of these kilonovae, they found there are rich amount of heavy elements beyond iron is being produced by these merging events. So yeah, so I think, did I go out of the topic, or I forgot? So yeah, so we know there are evidences that these hard process elements could have been made through other observations in the extragalactic supernovae and gravitational wave merging events.
All right. Next question. How do massless photons get converted to electrons which have mass? Won't this disobey conservation of mass if mass is being created from a massless entity?
Yeah, so these are so photons converted into matter and antimatter, like basically electrons and positrons are made from them. So yeah, I don't know about the mass conservation aspect. Yeah, I think it doesn't, but I'm not really an expert to say that, but like for example, if you go into quarks at that level, these photons, and I don't know, it kind of, yeah, I probably I shouldn't answer this, but I think looking more into the more fundamental particles where these protons and neutrons belong to other quarks, right? So then it may obey the conservation, I think, but I don't know.
Okay. Next question. If we don't know anything about the inner layers of sun, how do we know that the layers even exist?
Okay, we know we only, what I meant to say was we only probe the outer layers through these spectroscopy of in the optical wavelengths, that is like visible wavelengths. We only probe the outer regions. That's what I meant to say. But we can also probe the inner layers. This area is also called the seismology. Like we can, so this is like your hydrogen atoms. If you would know all these various modes, radial modes, various angular momentum modes. So like that, a spherical star also will oscillate into different modes. That will be observed as shifts in the radial velocities of both in brightness and also in some cases in the spectral lines. So that way you can also understand the interior structure. But the very center, we know neutrinos come out of that. So, and we also need to know the stability. So if a star has to be stable, you need to have an energy source. So for all these, through all this information, we know that there is a nuclear region in the nuclear burning center and then outer layers. But there are very different ways to probe. We could, like seismology is one of the important ways.
Okay. Next question. How do we get the entire chemical composition for the sun?
Okay. So the question, does it mean from interior to outside? Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's what.
Okay. Yeah, let me assume like from the interior to outside, we we don't know through observations, but directly from the spectral lines, we can't probe them. But there are based on, so we know the various transport mechanism, energy transport mechanism, and the stability, like how the star is stable, that we know, and various energy transport mechanisms we know. And based on that, like for example, there are discrete layers. Sometimes we have the hydrogen ionization zone, helium ionization zones. This happens at much interior layers. So these can, and we also know there is convection in the outer layers of the star and the radiative zone in the interiors. So these are again basically inferred from the theoretical equations, but yeah, the composition, yeah, we only know some discrete changes in beyond the convection zone. Like the convection happens when there is an abrupt change in the opacity or a sudden change in the absorption property of a medium. So that way we know the depths where convection can happen. So that forms at the layers where the sudden ionization, the atoms which are the nuclei or atoms that which are most dominant when they ionize, then sudden absorption property of the material or the whole layer will change. So we know some part of the outer layers through observations, but interiors is mainly through the through theory.
All right. Would a sufficiently massive clump of matter directly collapse to a black hole without first forming a hypermassive star?
Is it possible to, yeah, is it possible to galaxies were formed? Could you repeat the question? I didn't, I just.
Would a sufficiently massive clump of matter directly collapse to a black hole without first forming a hypermassive star?
Yeah, certainly it is possible, because we think any clump which is big enough to form core of greater than, let's say, 250 solar masses or so would directly collapse into a black hole. Yeah.
How exactly is the age of a star estimated? What about degenerate objects and black holes?
So ages of stars are estimated again based on theory, or sometimes we have for some stages, some stars we know, like for example, we know the primordial lithium in the interstellar medium, and a star which is going through convection, it would get the primordial lithium will be depleted. So based on the presence of lithium, the amount in the very early stages of star, we can find out from lithium. And for other stars, if they are in clusters, we know the age. But if there is if it is a star which is in the field, it's not in a group, then we use the evolutionary track theoretical models to say that, okay, this is the star's temperature. So from the spectroscopy, we know the star's photospheric temperature and their radius. So we know the mass and radius based on that. So that gives us a clue about where in the HR diagram they are. So we know what is the evolutionary phase it is in. So we use the theoretical models to say that, okay, if it has reached this mass and radius, it would have taken this much time. So that is the way, again, it's based on theory. So observationally, it's very difficult unless they are in cluster, or there are in the early stages we can find. There are also methods to find sometimes with brown dwarfs in the clusters which don't burn hydrogen. So there are some techniques, but it applies to only certain mass range and certain evolutionary phase. Yeah.
Next question. Why is it called baryonic universe?
Yeah. So we can probe only the baryons. We don't have much. We can't observationally probe a lot, except through gravitation for the dark matter. But otherwise, baryonic universe is what gives us this visible like beautiful sky all comes from the baryons. So maybe you could, it's fair to call baryonic universe.
All right, last question for the day. Is it possible that galaxies were formed by primordial black holes which served as seeds for galaxy formation?
Yeah, this is one of the open questions. So we don't know what is the seeds of these black holes which are in the centers of galaxy. We think the first stars which which became a black hole would have been seed, but then like let's say based on the temperature of the background, cosmic microwave background temperature at when hydrogen molecule could form, that is about, let's say, Z equal to 20, 30 or so, something at that epoch. So at that time, the temperatures are about 100K or so. And so based on, if you assume the Zeen, if you equate the hydrostatic equilibrium, you would get a Zeen's mass of like 1000 solar mass, something like that. So 1000 solar mass star would make a black hole about 100 solar mass or so. So if you start with a 100 solar mass black hole seed, and then we see quasars at redshifts of 10 or so. So quickly, if you make a supermassive black hole from starting from at redshift 20, that's too quick. You can't make such fast accretion and forming a supermassive black hole. So it's an open problem what are the seeds of these supermassive black holes which sits in the center. People think it is not likely the primordial first stars, remnants of the first stars, but it could be there are some theories maybe after Rihanna's, it's still, we don't understand that. There are black holes which could form something called atomic halo, not a molecular halo. So there are some things like that. Yeah, it's again an open problem. We still don't understand. These are all very good questions. Yeah.
So with this, we bring the Q&A session to a close. First of all, I'd like to thank Professor Shivrani on behalf of all of us for taking the time out of her busy schedule to give this extremely informative session. So thank you so much, ma'am. Second of all, I'd like to thank the moderators for handling the questions. And I feel a big shout out and thank you is due to Professor Nirupam Roy and the students of the Joint Astronomy Program for their immense support throughout the entire process of setting these talks and workshops up. Furthermore, all of this was made possible by a team that has worked tirelessly reaching out to people, putting together posters, setting up the website, and so much more. I'd like to take a moment to thank Team Pravega as a whole for handling so much work so well. Last but definitely not the least, we thank everyone who has attended today, and we hope you enjoyed the talks and learned loads. Thank you for tuning in to today's sessions, and we hope to see you tomorrow. So thank you and take care.
Thank you all. These are all very good questions. I really loved.